All right, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today we're diving into the world of federal procurement, specifically the FAR and DFARS frameworks. Now, I know it sounds a bit dry, but stick with us, because understanding these regulations is absolutely crucial if you're working with government contracts. Paul, you've spent decades in this space. Can you give us the basics? What exactly are FAR and DFARS, and who do they apply to?
Absolutely, Eric. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, is the primary set of rules governing procurement by most executive agencies in the U.S. government. It covers everything from how agencies describe their needs to how they select suppliers, award contracts, and manage performance. Now, the DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, is, as the name suggests, a supplement to the FAR, specifically for the Department of Defense. So if you're working with DoD contracts, you're dealing with both FAR and DFARS. But here's the thing. These regulations only apply to procurement contracts using appropriated funds. They don't apply to grants, cooperative agreements, or things like real property leases. And importantly, they don't directly apply to the legislative or judicial branches, though those branches can choose to use them if they want.
So just to clarify, if you're a supplier and you're getting a contract from, say, the Department of Agriculture, you're under FAR. But if it's the Army, you're under both FAR and DFARS. Is that right?
That's correct, Ruby. And it's worth noting, too, that these rules kick in when appropriated funds are being used. That's money coming out of the U.S. Treasury, authorized by Congress for a specific purpose. So if you're selling pencils to the government and they're paying with appropriated funds, you're in the FAR world.
And Paul, I always get a bit muddled on this. Do these rules apply to subcontractors as well, or just to prime contractors?
Good question. The FAR and DFARS apply directly to the relationship between the executive agency and the prime contractor. Subcontractors aren't directly bound by FAR or DFARS, but, and this is a big but, there are certain clauses that must be flowed down to subs. We'll get into that in a bit, but the key point is not everything flows down, and the government can't enforce those terms directly against subs. It's the prime's job to make sure the right clauses are included in their subcontracts.
Right, so it's not just a matter of copy-pasting every clause into every contract. There's a bit of nuance, which honestly is where people get tripped up. I mean, I've seen folks just throw the whole kitchen sink at their subs, and it's a mess.
Yeah, and that's where the risk comes in, isn't it? If you misapply these terms, you're not just making life harder for your suppliers. You're potentially increasing cost, reducing quality, and adding a whole lot of risk for everyone involved.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the framework is so important. If you get the basics wrong, everything downstream gets more complicated and expensive.
All right, let's dig into this whole flow down thing, because I reckon this is where a lot of people start to sweat. Paul, can you walk us through what actually needs to be flowed down to subcontractors and what doesn't?
Sure. So not every clause in the FAR or DFARS needs to be flowed down. Only those that are mandatory for the specific contract and relevant to the product or service the subcontractor is providing. For example, if you're buying a commercial off-the-shelf item and the clause is only mandatory for non-commercial items, you shouldn't include it. The idea is to avoid overburdening your subs with requirements that don't actually apply to them. And just to be clear, the government can't enforce these clauses directly against the sub. The prime is responsible for making sure the right terms are in place.
So if I'm a prime contractor, I need to be really clear on what my subs are actually delivering. Right? Like, is it a commercial item? Is it a service? Is it something else? Because that determines what flows down.
Exactly. You need to know what the sub is providing, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, and which clauses are mandatory for that specific situation. And you also need to be aware of the order of precedence. So, what takes priority if there's a conflict between the statement of work, the purchase order, the terms and conditions, and so on?
And look, I've seen this firsthand. If you just slap every clause you can find into a sub's contract, you're not just making their life miserable, you're probably driving up your own costs. Suppliers will pad their prices to cover the extra risk, or just to deal with the paperwork. And that doesn't mean they're actually compliant either. Sometimes it's just insurance or legal fees, or honestly, just the cost of dealing with the nonsense.
That's right. More requirements don't equal more compliance. They just mean more cost and potentially more risk if the terms don't actually fit the work being done. And if you misapply terms, you can end up with delays, lower quality, and a lot of headaches for both the prime and the sub.
So what's the best way to get this right? Is there a checklist or a process people should follow?
There are definitely some best practices. First, categorize the procurement. Figure out if it's commercial or non-commercial, what type of product or service it is, and what the relevant categories are under the FAR. Then, identify the mandatory flow-down clauses for that specific contract. Make sure you're clear on the data requirements, what's being created, stored, or transmitted, and communicate that to the sub. And crucially, have a feedback loop. The sub should review the requirements, provide feedback, and you should be willing to adjust the contract if needed. It's a process, not a one and done thing.
And just to add, if you're the sub, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you don't know what you're signing up for, you're on the hook for all the costs and liabilities. It's not just the procurement team's job to figure this out. It usually takes a bit of cross-team collaboration.
Yeah, and there are some great resources out there too. The Acquisition Regulations site, the Smart Matrix, the DAU Clause Matrix. They're all really helpful for figuring out what actually applies. All right, so let's talk about negotiation, because this is where things get really interesting. Paul, what options do subs actually have when they're handed a contract full of terms, some of which might not even apply?
Subs have more power than they often realize. You can accept the terms, implement them, or if you think they're not applicable, you can negotiate. You can request modifications, reject certain terms, or even walk away if the terms are too onerous or were disclosed too late in the process. If you're the only company that can provide a particular product or service, you have even more leverage. But even if you're not, you can still push back, especially if the terms don't make sense for what you're delivering.
And honestly, sometimes you just have to say, hey, these clauses don't apply to what we're doing, or we weren't told about these requirements before we quoted, so we need to re-quote. It's not being difficult, it's just being smart. If you don't, you could end up stuck with costs you didn't plan for or requirements you can't actually meet.
Exactly. And when you're negotiating, look at it strategically first, then legally. Document your dispute angles. Like, is it a commercial item? Is the pricing the same as for non-government customers? Is it a mandatory flow down? And so on. Make sure you get a response from the prime before you agree to anything, and keep that documentation in your quote or statement of work. It can make a big difference if there's a dispute later on.
And don't forget to check the order of precedence in your contract. If there's a conflict between the terms and conditions, the statement of work, or the purchase order, you need to know which one takes priority. That can save you a lot of headaches down the line.
And look, if you're not sure, ask questions. Like, is this actually a deliverable to the government? What's the contract number? What information is being exchanged? If you don't get clear answers, that's a red flag. Don't be afraid to push for clarity. It's your business on the line.
That's right. And remember, negotiation isn't just about saying no. It's about finding a solution that works for both sides. Sometimes that means adjusting the contract. Sometimes it means walking away, but you always have options.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up for today. There's a lot more we could cover, but hopefully this gives everyone a solid foundation for navigating FAR, DFARS, and contract negotiations. Ruby, Paul, thanks for sharing your insights, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll be back soon with more on procurement and compliance. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Paul. Catch you all next time. Don't forget to check those clauses before you sign anything.
Thanks, Ruby, Eric. Stay vigilant out there and see you on the next episode.